Hey everybody. Okay, so today I want to talk about how to write. So if you want to be a better writer, you want to write better stories, here's how Stephen King does it. Let's get into it. So number one, and this goes without saying, is that he says you have to take writing seriously. He says you must not come lightly to the blank page. And that number two, you're also going to need a set of just like basic tools, things like vocabulary, grammar, dialogue, that kind of thing. So let's get into what those tools are. So with vocabulary, he says just use the vocabulary that you already have. You don't have to try to use big words to sound, smarter or impress people. Your personal vocabulary is totally fine. And when you write, he says just try to go with the first word that comes to your mind. If you hesitate, yes, you'll come up with another word, but it's probably not as good of a fit as the first word that you were going to use. Now, on to grammar. King says that basically we all know grammar. We pick it up from conversation, we pick it up from reading. So you don't really have to do anything to try to improve your grammar. For those of us who are writing in, the language that we are native speakers of, you should be fine with the grammar that you already know. He talks about the importance of verbs and nouns to make a sentence. But he specifically talks about verbs and says his advice there is to always use the active tense when writing. Basically, here's an example. You want to say the writer threw the rope. You don't want to say the rope was thrown by the writer. So, and on top of verbs, he talks about adverbs. And he actually really hates adverbs. And he says that for him, the road to hell is paved with adverbs. So he does not like adverbs. And adverbs are, of course, those words that end in ly that modify another word. So, like, for example, the word firmly is an adverb. And you could say in your sentence something like, she shut the door firmly, which is a totally okay sentence. But King would hate that. Or at least he'd ask you, hey, do you think that firmly really needs to be in there? He'd suggest that you just say, he closed the door, period. He says basically that you don't need adverbs, you don't need the word firmly because your reader's already going to know how the door was closed based on the story and the context that you've set around that scene. And that by using an adverb like firmly, we're just being redundant and kind of making our writing overly complicated. And he says that a lot of writers fall into using these adverbs because of fear, being afraid that like you won't get your point across, your reader won't understand what you're trying to say if you don't use them. Trust yourself to know that you wrote your story well enough. And he has a similar bent towards simplicity when it comes to dialogue. He says the best form of dialogue attribution is to really just say, he said, or she said, or some form of said. So don't add adverbs like she said menacingly or he said contemptuously. Again, he says you don't need those adverbs, that your story and how well you've told it will show the reader how somebody said something. And when it comes to paragraphs, same thing. He says keep it simple. And if you want your book to be an easy read, that you should use short paragraphs because short paragraphs more closely mimic how we talk, and that's a good thing. He says we don't really want our reader to feel like they're reading, right? You want to, he calls it like seduce them with your words, make them forget that they're reading a book. And the best way to do that is by writing how we talk. And he also says that using sentence fragments is totally fine because if you're too grammatically correct in a story while you're writing a story, your story is going to feel stiff. And writing good fiction isn't about being grammatically correct. It's about telling a story. Okay, so now on to what he says about what it takes to like be a good writer. He says, first of all, you have to do two things. You have to read a lot and you have to write a lot. Now he gets through 70 to 80 books a year. That's a lot of books. That's like 6 books a month. And we may not be able to match that pace, but if we want to be a good writer, we do have to read. Good books will teach us about good writing and the things that we want to emulate. And the bad books will teach us about the things that we want to avoid, the things we don't want to do. He said you can't expect people to like what you wrote if you don't read. And that if you don't have time to read, then you really don't have time to write. Now, when it comes to writing, how much is a lot, right? He says you need to write a lot. Well, how much is a lot? Now, he writes 2,000 words a day. For the rest of us, he says we can shoot for something lower, like 1,000 words a day, which to me It's still a lot of words, but I think the important part here is the daily part, regardless of how many words. The more you write, it's like exercise, the easier it will become. Andy says if you don't write daily, if you don't work on your story or on your book daily, your characters start to become stale in your mind and you lose your momentum, you lose your sense of what's happening in the story or where you're going. Now, when it comes to what to write about, of course, the answer to that is anything you want, right? Anything we feel like we can write about. But he suggests that as a beginner, write the genre that you love to read. So if you love to read science fiction, write that. If you love mysteries or romance novels, write that. Don't write something because you think someone else will like it or you're writing for someone else or because you think this is where the money is. He says focus on writing about the genres that you love. He says that stories actually make themselves, that stories are like fossils in the ground. They already exist. And your job as a writer is to dig it up and transcribe it. And this is why he doesn't like the idea of plotting out a storyline in advance. He thinks that stories that are written from an outlined plot feel artificial and labored. He says use your intuition, just like free write. Put your characters in different situations and then write it down as you watch them try to work themselves free. You might have an idea of what you'd like to happen, but don't demand that your characters follow that. And he says, if you as the writer are kind of in this state of suspense of like, well, what's going to happen next? Let's see. Then your readers are going to be that way too. He says, don't worry about how it ends. Every story is going to come out somewhere. Just keep writing. Okay, so now let's talk about what he says about description. And description is really how you help your reader visualize, see in their mind what you see in yours. King, again, he's on the side of simplicity. He's like, when you're giving descriptions, don't go overboard. That people aren't reading our stories for the beautiful descriptions. They're reading it for the story. You want the description to begin in your mind, but finish in the reader's mind. This is why I think I have such a tough time, and maybe you've experienced this too, with movies that are based off of books. Because how the producers see the characters and the places is not necessarily how I saw it in my imagination. And that's the real cool thing about books. Your imagination plays such a big part in co-creating with the writer. Okay, so now let's talk about building characters. So King says that building characters and writing good dialogue is really about listening to real people and observing how they talk and how they behave. If you want your characters to seem believable, sound believable, then they need to talk like regular people and they need to do things and respond to things like people would expect someone to do. And he says that every character you write has a little piece of you in it. So if you're not sure what your character would do or what they're going to say, think about, well, what would I say in this situation or what would I do? And then use that. And over time, your characters will come to life and start making these decisions on their own. And you're just, of course, they're transcribing like, wow, that's what they just said. Okay, so he says that it's important when you're writing a story to do 2 drafts. And the first draft is the one you do completely by yourself. You don't get any input from anyone else. The way he likes to do it is just bang it out, as fast as he can, exactly as it's coming to his mind, day after day, and not worrying too much about it, just getting the story out. And he says once you're done with that first draft, do not look at it right away. Don't reread it. Leave it alone. He says put it in a drawer, put it away, close your computer. Just don't touch it. And he actually says don't touch it for at a minimum of 6 weeks, which seems like a really long time, I know, and probably difficult to do because we're like excited, we've got this story done. But he says this is why it's important to just let it rest. You're going to need to make serious edits once you do read it. And it's going to be easier to do that when you have some distance from the story. He says then you'll be able to, what he calls, kill your darlings. The things that maybe you wouldn't have been able to part with right after you wrote it. And then for the second draft, that's when you go out and you can have some of your, close friends read it, get some of their feedback. You'll read it, obviously. You'll look for where you need to add or, bring something more to life. Like you'll find the areas that need adjustment. But he says, with your second draft, he says that every story can be edited and that if you're not able to remove 10% of your story from your second draft, then you're just not trying very hard. So there you have it. Those are kind of the key things that I got out of this book on writing. from Stephen King. I found the perspective that he shares in this book on writing really freeing, really doable. I used to think that writing a story was like magic. You know, I could only come up with the beginning and I never could get through the middle or the end. And now I see that it's not magic, it just takes some work, that we can do it too. So, how motivating is that? Anyway, I hope that you found this video useful. And if you have any books on writing that you really love, I'd love to know. So, until my next video, I hope you all be well.